record is known, and also the perpetrators are known. They'll probably, in my generation, the slogan was, hey, hey, LBJ, how many kids did you kill today? Referring to Lyndon Baines Johnson, the president during the war in Vietnam. I think Genocide Joe is going to go down also. That will be remembered. So all of that seemed superfluous to go through the record again. If I had great narrative powers, I would have done it. I don't know if you've read, and I don't know if even your viewers will know, it was a wonderful, wonderful book written on the Israeli invasion of Lebanon in 1982. Long forgotten how between 15 and 20,000 Palestinian and Lebanese were killed, overwhelmingly civilians. It was, up until Gaza was by far the biggest bloodletting. And there was a British historian, British journalist, Robert Fisk. He wrote this book, Pity the Nation. Really breathtaking. It's a breathtaking piece of narrative history. I don't have those narrative powers. I have good expository powers. Narrative powers. I have good expository powers. I can sit down, analyze a document, and I can logically go through it, and I don't leave any wiggle room. You're cornered, you're trapped, it's case closed. So I didn't waste my time on the documenting the facts. What I did do was I wanted to look at agencies, institutions from which you expect better. The International Court of Justice, the International Criminal Court, the UN Commissions of Inquiry, Amnesty, Human Rights Watch, and where you expect better, and to hold them accountable, not just the usual suspects, but also other people who, because of careerism, cupidity, cowardice, they sold their souls. Now, I want to be clear, the record was not terrible by the international institutions. It was not. We don't want a straw man. It was not terrible. The statements by the UN senior officials like Philippe Lazzarini, the head of UNRWA, Gutierrez, a lot of it was quite good. And I acknowledge that. But there are other things that were terrible. Now, so far I've spoken in abstract.
We're gonna dial in on that for sure.
Let me just, okay, so it's coming later.
Yeah.
So that was my modus operandi.
Yeah.
When I wrote Gaza, an inquest into its martyrdom, nobody knew any of it. And it's a very terrible story. I won't call it tragic, because the Greek term tragic means the fate was preordained. Not preordained. This was systematic, methodical, and intentional. And it's a horrible history, and I wrote to chronicle. This time, though, I wrote to indict. To hold these people accountable, and I still hope they will be held accountable. Yeah. There are certain officials who either should be censured or they should be ousted from office, and I named them very clearly.
Yeah, and we're going to get to that, but I do want to start with your prologue, because the book opens briefly with October 7, but it actually very quickly shifts into Nat Turner's 1831 slave revolt. And despite ordering his followers to kill all white people, he's now revered as an American freedom fighter, which you also talk about. You ask, before he stands condemned, must it be asked, except to live and die in thraldom, what alternative did Nat Turner have? You also mentioned at the time, revered white abolitionist William Lloyd Garrison expressed horror over the events that took place, but blamed the white slave-owning population, saying, "We have warned our countrymen of the danger of persisting in their unrighteous conduct." I've also utilized the Nat Turner Rebellion example when referencing October 7. You have as well. I've seen your interactions on Piers Morgan, which is, an interesting affair. We can talk about that later as well. But I wanted to hear, do you view yourself as a modern-day equivalent of the white abolitionist after writing about the Zionist oppression of Palestine for over 4 decades now? And obviously, you're probably a little too humble to answer that in a similar manner, but what other warnings have been ignored that you've been ringing the alarm bells on?
First of all, one has to acknowledge one's precursors, and one has to acknowledge one's current collaborator. There have been many people, it's still a small number, but it's still a number. My precursors were people like Noam Chomsky, Israel Shahar from the country Israel, Edward Said. They came before me, and in many ways I learned from them both their steadfastness and also their mental powers, their dedication, their conscientious. I would say now I've entered the age where they're gone. They're not on the scene anymore, and so the mantle has, so to speak, has been passed to me. I don't believe I had any great powers of predicting. A lot of my analysis since October 7th, I believe, has been borne out. But in general, those who predicted that if Israel continued occupation, it was going to be a dramatic deterioration in Israeli society. A fellow, I suspect you've never heard of him, Yeshayahu Leibovich, and he was Israel's great philosopher. He had 4 PhDs, a smart guy, and he, along with a certain number of others, said as early as 1967, this occupation is going to be a complete disaster. He coined the phrase, by the way, Yeshayahu Leibovich, who was the most revered intellectual. He coined the phrase, Israel is turning into a country of Judeo-Nazis.
People say that term actually originated from David Duke sometimes.
What's interesting is not bright enough to originate it.
So what's interesting on that point that you just mentioned is one of the examples that I often use is the horror in reaction to the Deir Yassin massacre from the likes of Albert Einstein, who has gone back and forth and has a more complex, I think, experience with Zionism and what it turned into. But his commitment to binationalism and living alongside peacefully with the Jewish and the Palestinian population was very clear. And he is the example that I usually go to, which is really interesting because The Atlantic actually wrote a whole article on me deploying the Albert Einstein example, saying that this was actually wrong, that Albert Einstein was a huge Zionist and loves Israel, and I was lying about his background. Are you familiar with some of the things that Einstein has said about?
I've read his writings. I have to say I'm a bit of a skeptic about the possibilities of coexistence.
We're going to get to that as well.
Between the Jews and the indigenous Arab population, because there was such a sense of contempt for Arabs, Muslims, the indigenous population, and such a sense of a double kind of superiority by the Jewish settlers. There was superiority being European. And then that was compounded, or you might say determined by the sense of Jews feeling superior, a sense of superiority born of a certain notion of Jews being chosen people. And then there was just the sense of the backwardness of the Arab Muslim community in general. So when you fill out the historical picture, the probability of a real coexistence among equals, I think, was not really very plausible. There were some individuals who weren't bad. The first head of the university, a fellow named Judah Magnus, I think he was a pretty decent fellow, so far as I can tell, reading stuff. But I don't think it was really very possible. I mean, the most honest formulation came from now a right-wing Israeli historian who wasn't always right-wing, Benny Morris,
who you've had the pleasure of debating.
Yeah, he said that the idea of transfer is the euphemism for expulsion. He said the idea of transfer was inbuilt and inevitable in Zionism. I think that's a more honest reckoning of where things stood back then. So I'm not a believer that the real possibility of coexistence. It's certainly got much uglier in recent years. You could say the ugliness is either more honesty or, the expression that hypocrisy is the complement that face virtue. The older generation, they weren't so in your face. You mentioned Menachem Begin. Menachem Begin, he would be considered now the far left of this term.
Yeah.
He would. But during his first term of office, he was elected in 1977. Well, you know what one of his first acts was? He abolished torture. Israel was practicing torture against Palestinian detainees. And right after the 1967 war, now this guy, Begin was...
Too woke for Israel now.
Exactly. Begin was a lawyer by training, and he was a stickler about the law. And torture was illegal. So he did abolish it. I mean, nowadays, he couldn't even imagine that. It's not even conceivable.
Nowadays, the only time that Israel ever prosecutes any war criminals in their ranks is when they intercept communications of ICC prosecutors in an effort to utilize the complementarity principle against the ICC to act as though they're doing a show, a mock trial, basically, to hopefully stop the ICC from further prosecuting their war crimes, which again we'll talk about. I wanted to continue in the epilogue.
I want to just return to
Go ahead.
the Nat Turner analogy. This is another background. When October 7th first happened, the first couple of days, I don't know if you remember.
Oh, I remember.
Right. The first couple of days, this looked like a prison breakout.
Yeah.
And they said about 50 people were killed, and that's not even the blink of an eye. So I immediately made my sentiments known that I supported.
I also remember that.
The prison breakout. And I had no qualms about it. Function. And it became clear that something much bigger happened. Something that much bigger happened. Got it. You know, it was hard to try to think it through. Just figure out, well, where do I stand? Probably on the order of 1,200 people were killed. I would say the evidence is pretty clear. About 850 were civilians.
Yeah.
And of those 850 civilians, as of now, readily available material, overwhelmingly were killed by Palestinian militants. Yeah, that's a large number. I get around. That's a large number. When Sabra and Shatila happened in 1982, the massacre in Lebanon, the initial numbers that came out, they turned out to be low. The initial numbers that came out were about 800 Palestinians were slaughtered in Sabra and Shatila. In fact, probably closer to 2,000. But even when 800 came out, that was considered a very large number. Yeah. And then if you take, you're from Egypt, when Sisi came to power, you know, he committed the massacre at Rabat Square, the nonviolent protesters. And the estimate by Human Rights Watch, about 1,000 were killed. And that's was seen as it was the largest single massacre in Egyptian history. So that was seen a large number. And now I'm faced with about 850 civilians killed on October 7th. And what do you do with it? What do you do with it? Now, under normal circumstances, namely for the last 40 years, I don't say this with pride, I'm just saying it factually. I normally would have consulted Professor Chomsky. I considered his moral judgment, if not near impeccable, and I usually defer to his moral judgment. But he wasn't available, and I was sweating for around a week, because I knew a lot of people were going to want to know what I think, and I was torn. I was torn between the fact that I knew, having spent about the last 20 years, I knew what had been done to the people of Gaza. I knew the detail, the horror of what those folks endured. On the other hand, there was a mass slaughter. And what do you do with it? I thought. I walked the streets. I just figured this out. And it happened that the last book I had written was on wokeness, and I had read a lot about the abolition, and I had read, of course, about Nat Turner. So I turned to Nat Turner, the rebellion. I said, you know what? Roughly it's about the same. What the slaves endured, not much different. You know, Gaza from 1948, when it was under Egyptian rule, from 1948, it was repeatedly described as a concentration camp by outside visitors, even the extreme right wing, head of Israel's National Security Council, Giora Eiland, who's still among us. He was one of the advisors during the Gaza. Described in 2004, he described Gaza as a concentration camp. He said it's a huge concentration camp. So now, I knew what they had endured. I knew there had been a massacre, a slaughter of significant dimension. And then, what do you do with it? I saw Nat Turner rebellions, more or less analogous. First order, kill all white people. And that's what they proceeded to do. They went from house to house, smashed the skulls of women, killed men. Even in this case, they did behead babies. Not on October 7th, but in Nat Turner rebellion. So now I have the analogy. But then there's a second step. You got the analogy, where do you stand on it? And I thought the right place to look were the abolition. They were of sublime moral character. They were courageous, they were consistent, and they were very smart. You don't get people smarter than Charles Sumner, Frederick Douglass. They were really impressive. And when I went back to read their writings, what became very clear was they would not condemn that. They would not. They condemned the white system that forced Nat Turner to do what he did, that the coercive system that created Nat Turner. Then I felt, okay, if I'm wrong, then the white abolitionists and black abolitionists, they're wrong.
Including Frederick Douglass.
Frederick Douglass is an interesting case.
Yeah.
Because the abolitionists were against violence.
Yeah.
They believed in what they called moral suasion. But Douglass described Nat Turner as one of our glorious martyrs, one of our revolutionary martyrs. Same thing, W.E.B. Du Bois.
Yeah.
They all acclaim Nat Turner. Now, what's also interesting is the black people at the time, they did not condemn that. They were exactly.
Well, I know that from your book.
Yeah, he came to occupy a place in African American folklore, and he became a folk hero. They would refer to him as, quote, Old Nat's War. Old Nat's War. They understood whatever the methods, whatever the horrors, and as you quoted William Lloyd Garrison, he recognized horrors occurred. But where did it come from ultimately? What was its deep source? Its deep source was the desire for freedom, struggle for human dignity. Maybe it was wrongly expressed, but there's another question. What option did they have? If you're speaking honestly, what option did the people of Gaza have? They tried diplomacy. They tried international law. They tried nonviolent civil resistance. They tried everything. And it was all a dead end. And as you probably remember, by October 6, 2023, the only game in town was would the Saudis join the Abraham Accords.
Yeah.
Gaza had been forgotten. Well, and then the rest of the system, to be publicly pay the rest of the system.
Yeah. So going into this analogy a little bit further, because you brought up the fact that binationalism was destined to fail from the start, given the supremacist attitudes from the early Zionists, doubly supremacist considering that there's the European colonialism aspect to it, but then also Jewish supremacy directly. I agree with that, but we live in the United States of America, which is a country that is objectively white supremacist in its fundamentals, and yet we now live in a country that has obviously a very complex history and still continues to struggle with offering any kind of real restitution to Black Americans. And yet I always go back to that same comparison about the abolition of the apartheid. And that is part of the reason why I present the one-state solution and, forcible reintegration of everyone, including the oppressed and the oppressor, living side by side in a secular solitary state as the true North Star. Now, of course, what's more important from my perspective is how the Palestinians feel about that. And there is not that big of a commitment to a one-state solution. I think for the most part, historically, it's always been a two-state solution. There are additional complications that come along with that. But if we're just simply talking about the morality of it, or maybe even pie-in-the-sky idealism, the reason why I believe in the abolition of the occupation and the apartheid, with, of course, reparations offered to the Palestinians, a right to return and everything else, not dissimilar to what Avi Shlaim has also talked about, is because I'm an American citizen. And if it can happen here, and although there are still many issues, I think the contemporary Black experience is probably better than the current experience of a Palestinian, both in the West Bank and certainly in Gaza as well. So I feel like that is a path towards progress. It would require tremendous amounts of outside pressure from not only the international community, specifically the United States of America, American Jews as well, with connections back to Israel, familial connections. But that is what I believe. You're saying that is not possible because Zionist fascism is far too powerful of a force in Israeli society.
I wouldn't use the word fascism only because I don't believe it's a relevant term. I think Jewish supremacy is a better description. The question I think comes down to this, it's a judgment call. Remember, we had two processes in the United States. You referred to the African American experience. They came as slaves. The Civil War freed them legally, then set in the system of Jim Crow. And de facto, things were better than slavery, but not significantly better than slavery. Yeah. apartheid, and then the civil rights movement, and now I think you have to be very dogmatic to the point of blindness to say there hasn't been any improvement in the situation of African Americans.
Of course.
Since slavery, since Jim Crow, and even since the civil rights. That's one trajectory. There's a second trajectory. It's the Native Americans. And the Native Americans, it turned into a zero-sum game. Either it's them or us. Was there a possibility with the Native Americans, not African, was there a possibility with the Native Americans of a kind of synthesis, symbiosis, transcendence, speaking honest answers?
Yeah.
Speaking honest answers.
Yeah, but
It's
Norm
very
Chomsky's brought this up as well, where he says that unlike the apartheid in South Africa, where there was utility to the black population, which is 90% of the entire population as a part of the labor force, Israeli society broadly just wants to ethnically cleanse the indigenous population and would rather hire outside labor from Thailand or numerous other places around the country, around the world.
So I don't know which is the right analogy.
Yeah.
It was very striking to me when I was reading about the abolitionists, including Douglas, by the way. They were very, very harsh on the Native Americans. They didn't have any good words or kind words to say. They all saw them. I'm talking about Douglas, Sumner, the others. They all saw the Native Americans as savages. And it's the Euro-American project was to advance. They had to push aside. It was zero sum. There was no notion that we can live together. So the question is, which is the Israeli experience closer to? I'm inclined. Look, I don't want to be totally pessimistic about it, and I recognize people change. Let's say you could say Germany and Japan were horror shows during the first third of the 20th century. They were, you could say, at the extreme end of imperialist, racist countries. Okay? You could say, okay, Germany and Japan, they're no longer horror shows. That's true. They're probably more Pacific end of the political spectrum. But the Jewish question was solved. It was solved by their extermination. So they didn't have to contend with it.
There's also still a lot of residual racism in Japanese society as well.
Right.
I'm not talking about the German philosophicism.
Right.
Yeah.
Look, there are all sorts of nuances, but the bottom line is, yes, it's true, Germany today is very far that Germany was in the 1930s, but it's also true to say the Jewish question was solved. It was solved by their extermination. The Native American question was basically solved in our country by their expulsion and significantly, not entirely, but significantly elements of extermination. As I say, I don't want to be totally pessimistic, though one thing I am totally pessimistic about, the current mindset of the Israelis is off the charts. One thing I think is there are several misunderstandings about the concept, and one misunderstanding is not a war. There's never a war in Gaza. Every time you use the word war to describe what happened in Gaza, you become wittingly or unwittingly a tool of Israeli propaganda.
Yeah.
Once you say war to describe the unfolding of events, Israel has won 90% of the propaganda battle. Once we two are sitting here, you may say you're against what's happening. I say I support what Israel is doing in Gaza. But if we establish as the common
This is not chaos.
The war in Gaza, Israel has won 90%. There was never a war in Gaza.
Yeah.
A war
Bro.
denotes something very clear. It denotes
I'm trying to
you're
play
trying
chaos
to
mode.
inflict
Fuck.
a military
I wanna know
defeat
what I'm playing
on
with
the
right away.
opposing army. That's what a war is. To inflict a military defeat on the opposing army. Now, in the course of a war, civilians sometimes get killed. Well, the technical term, collateral damage.
Yeah.
Also, virtually every war, but not every war, but virtually every war, has
No.
a terror component. That is, you're targeting the civilians in order to break the will of the other side. But even when you have a terroristic component, the goal is to inflict that military defeat. A genocide is kind of just the opposite. The goal of the genocide is to exterminate the civilian population. It's not collateral damage. It's not even a secondary component like in terror bombing. It's the goal. And defeating the military in a genocide is completely secondary. You're not trying to defeat the military in a genocide. You're trying to extinguish the whole population.
Yeah.
So, if you take the case of Gaza, I know there are a lot of people on the left like to say, Hamas is resisting and Hamas has put up a resistance and Israel hasn't achieved its aim. That's just fantasy. If I were to ask you, you followed events closely since October 7th. Can you name me one battle? A battle. Have you heard of a single battle in Gaza? I haven't. I follow it every day.
I was trying to get the FADA does a decent job of covering some of the aesthetic on the ground resistance elements. But you're right, it's not like a real battle.
I believe it's fantasy.
Yeah.
And the problem is, it's not just fantasy. It feeds Israeli propaganda. Because they can keep saying, Hamas is not yet disarmed. We won't leave Gaza until Hamas is disarmed. And you give them a pretext. You give them an excuse to protract the genocide.
You found the dream car, but it's 1,000 miles away. With UShip, you're in the driver's seat. Post your vehicle, then compare quotes to find the price.
To protract the genocide. So, there I believe that's one misunderstanding of the nature of the conflict in Gaza. And there was a second, but just slipped my mind. It'll come back to me, sure. Where I believe that you have to get the language right, to understand what happened there.
It's always been an ethnic cleansing campaign from the Nakba onward, and even before that, pogroms here and there. It was always settler colonial ambition, and
I would say that there, as I say, I agree with Benny Morris.
Yeah.
The idea of transfer was inevitable.
Yeah.
Now, there were periods when they were willing to settle with confining the population, keeping, as I said, to keep as much of the land and as few of the people.
Yeah.
What made October 7th different was Israel changed its strategy. Its strategy up until October 7th was, they're very open
mowing
about
the
it.
lawn.
Yeah, it was mowing the lawn.
Yeah.
Periodically, they'll go in and remind the natives who's in charge.
Yeah.
Or even just use Gaza as an excuse for various other goals they had. But after October 7th, they decided, now we're going to solve the Gaza question.
Yeah.
And solving the Gaza question was very clear. They were very clear about from day one. They were going to, instead of mow the lawn, they were going to extirpate. For your listeners, extirpate is the fancy word for pull out by the roots.
Yeah.
They were going to extirpate every blade of grass in Gaza. And that meant including the 1.1 million children. And that was their goal. And then their means, their method of carrying out this massive ethnic cleansing, the means was genocide. It was going to intentionally target the civilian population for destruction until and unless Gaza was emptied out of its Arab population.
Can I ask you something about October 7 in particular? Because there's two different schools of thought on this, where some people have looked at the prior knowledge that the Israeli security forces must have had. There was obviously talks of Egypt giving a forewarning, an advanced warning. The Unit 8200 was surveilling Gaza. Gaza is the most surveilled territory on the planet, pretty much, an open-air prison, a concentration camp. What is your assessment on whether or not this was utilized as an opportunity, where there was forewarning, there was advanced warning that a military campaign could take place by the Palestinian Resistance Front, and that that Benjamin Netanyahu probably tried to use this as a opportunity to create casus belli to carry out the final solution to the, I guess, Palestinian question?
First of all, we're going to be here for a while. You should feel free to ask me any questions. You said you were scared. You should
I'm getting more confident. I'm getting more comfortable.
You should overcome your fear and be aggressive in your questioning. And these questions, I'm sure, come up, what you just asked, come up with your listeners. And here's an opportunity, not for me to give a definitive answer, but certainly to give an informed opinion on this. First of all, let's take an analogy. Analogies are never perfect. They serve a purpose. If you look at 9/11, there were many people in the administration who predicted Osama bin Laden would launch an attack. There was one national intelligence fellow, I forgot his name, he wrote a book on the subject, where he said, I knew from day one, from the moment it happened. He ran into the Oval Office and he said, it's Osama bin Laden. I know it's Osama bin Laden. He had been on their radar, and they had received warnings that something like this would happen.
The Northern Force in Afghanistan had actually tried to deliver Osama bin Laden to the United States of America for his, I think, cooperation in the previous World Trade Center bombing on Glen Sheikh, and those people were assassinated prior.
I don't recall that detail, so you'll forgive me. The thing is, when you're a country like the United States and Israel, you're being bombarded with threats, possible threats, potential threats every day. And then you have to have a hierarchy, which you're going to take seriously and which you're not going to take seriously. When you're so saturated with racism, like people like Netanyahu and his folks, they don't believe Hamas could pull something like that off. Hamas was a shooting gallery. I mean, Gaza was a shooting gallery for Israel. It was, as I call it, these were killing sprees, which they used to launch into Gaza. You know, the discrepancy in number killed, like 100 to 1, 200 to 1. They didn't think Hamas had the capability, the capacity to pull off something like that. So I'm sure they received reports.
Hamas thought.
I totally agree as well. Totally agree.
They admitted it.
They were shocked by how easy it was.
Yeah.
You know?
So how much of that do you think is hubris, and how much of that do you think could have been maybe hubris paired up with opportunity?
Oh, you know, there's a cliche. The cliche goes, every crisis is an opportunity. When 9/11 happened, they got together in the Situation Room. Nate Cheney, Rumsfeld, Colin Powell, and they shed 4 or 5 salty tears. And then they rubbed their palms. Oh, seriously.
Yeah, no.
What can we get out of it? And they then start contemplating. If you read the accounts, they're looking at the map. Which country should we attack? Which country? A crisis is an opportunity. Now, as you know, the big opportunity for them started with Afghanistan, but Afghanistan was slow change. They were going to go after, in their minds, it was going to be Iraq, Syria, Iran. That was
What?
They were going to exploit everything they could out of 9/11. And that was exactly the Israelis. It was going to be first Gaza, if the opportunity arises, the West Bank, and then it's going to be Hezbollah, Syria, Iran. Every crisis is an opportunity. But I don't think there's any rational point in denying it was a real crisis. they're just not the type because they attach such value to a Jewish life
Yeah.
and no value to any non-Jewish life. They're not the type that would allow
Sacrificing
yeah.
envelope.
So that's actually really interesting. I agree with you 100% on this. My attitude on this has been part hubris and part, at most, it would be a couple people that get slaughtered as a sacrificial lamb to enact a much larger campaign of death and destruction. And this will be the casus belli, but it, of course, unfolded in a way that the Israeli security apparatus could not have predicted, that Hamas itself could not have predicted as well. And perhaps that's like the middle ground. I don't know, but that's my assessment. I'm not married to the idea either, but I don't believe that it was like pre-planned that Benjamin Netanyahu was allowing 1,200 Israelis to be killed, with as many civilians that were killed in the process as well. Part of the reason why I bring this up is because there's some information about like the Nova Festival, adding an additional day, being so close to the border wall, and things of that nature have raised suspicion, even inside of the Israeli population as well. There have been some inquiries.
The Nova, for your listeners, is a music festival, the Supernova Music Festival.
Yeah.
And the largest number of people killed by far, in the total, about 350 of the total number of those killed. As far as it's known, Hamas didn't even know it was going to happen. They just stumbled on it, the Nova Festival. It probably, you can speculate, but it probably enraged them. Right, bordering on this concentration camp, all these young people who are overwhelmingly of military age, because the Nova was young men and women, they're all having this festival. It's almost feels like a taunt. And so it was very bloody.
Oh, yeah.
No question in my mind, but I don't think, as far as I understand, they were not knowledgeable that festival was going to happen. I think there's a tendency on the left, and not just the left, actually across the board, to always want to see conspiracies. And I think a lot of things happen actually in politics and history which can be explained. They cannot. There are all sorts of, so to speak, loose ends. I can't really explain how that happened. It doesn't change the total picture. I remember, if I can give one anecdote, there was a famous trial in the UK. It was a Holocaust denier. His name was David Irving, very prominent historian.
Deborah.
And Deborah Lipstadt.
Yeah, Deborah Lipstadt.
David Irving was an extremely smart guy. I mean, I wouldn't call him brilliant, but he was definitely a competent historian. Deborah Lipstadt's just a talking cow. She's a complete imbecile.
For those who don't know, she was Biden's anti-Semitism czar, and also a horrifyingly right-wing, genocide denier herself.
I wouldn't even dignify her with polish. She's just an imbecile. In any event,
she's the one who's made the Bieber jokes and has very vociferously defended Israel's genocide.
Yeah. Oh, she said talking about somebody Jewish nursing home in Miami. In any event, so there's a point in the trial. David Irving conducted the trial himself. He was the defendant. By the way, in the trial, the lawyers would not let Deborah Lipstadt speak. He was in the gag order, her own lawyers, because they knew the moment she opened her mouth, they were going to lose the case, and she's a complete imbecile. In any event, there was a point in the trial where one of the leading historians in the Nazi Holocaust, his name is Christopher Browning, and David Irving presents Browning with a document. And the document seems to say the opposite of what it should say. And Irving looks at the document and he says, "You're correct. It does say exactly the opposite of what I would have guessed." So Irving said, "How do you explain that?" And you know what Browning said? I can't. There are all sorts of things that happen which there isn't a clear explanation. But that doesn't mean the overall picture is wrong. A Nazi Holocaust did happen, even if you can't explain this or that document. And it's the same thing. I believe that what happens with conspiracy theories is they take one point here, one point there and then inflated to prove the whole thing could not have happened. No, the whole thing did happen, but this point and that point can't really explain it. Can't really explain it. I believe it's a problem with these conspiracy theories.
Yeah.
Overall, I think the picture is pretty clear. Though I acknowledge, we should be careful about this. Not careful, cautious. Israel has never led an international human rights investigation of what happened. They've not let them in. So we're relying in significant part on testimonies which human rights organizations received over the web, in front of a computer screen, and on an Israeli information. But as I said, what we know so far, I think the general picture is a slaughter of a significant magnitude occurred.
Yeah.
The question is not whether the slaughter occurred. I believe it did. It's explaining it, understanding it.
Yes.
And that's what I try to do in the book. I try to make sense of it.
Yeah. As far as the slaughter goes, I don't think people deny that. Or I guess maybe there are some.
No, there were quite a few.
I guess there are some people who want to operate under the boundaries of perfect victimhood in some respects, where they also think that resistance is supposed to be perfect, which is something that I've brought up over and over again, and I've actually been yelled at quite a bit by the likes of Josh Gottheimer. The ADL has been after me for the past 3 years, and they've created this glossary for me as the arch anti-Semite, as they call me, which is laughable because I've spent my whole life combating fascism and combating anti-Semitism as well. And one of the things that they constantly go back to, and this ties into the second chapter of your book that we're going to get to in a second, is at the time I was talking to people in my audience in a relatively hostile environment where they were frustrated with me, and they were saying, like, why don't you just reflexively deny that the likelihood that rapes happened at all? And there's this moment where I respond to them and say, look, at the time, we did not have enough evidence for whether it had happened or not, but there was certainly evidence unfolding that there was no systematic mass rapes that had taken place at the directive of Hamas leadership. That was very clearly something that you also point to in chapter 2 of your book, where you extensively cover the ways in which the propaganda apparatus greatly overemphasizes these heinous sexual crimes that took place with very little evidence at the time to tie it back to white supremacist birth of a nation comparisons were made. The barbaric indigenous forces are engaging in
that was wild fucking
the superior
dude, what the fuck?
Of the Israeli population.
Bullshit. Oh.
So I responded,
Nice.
It doesn't matter if rapes happened on October 7th. That doesn't change the calculation for me at all. Whether or not they happened at the time, we didn't have enough evidence. But even if it did, it wouldn't justify genocide. And that's something that, to this day, CNN and all of these other outlets love utilizing as a quote that they clipped out of context to say, it doesn't matter if rapes happened on October 7th. And I find that very frustrating as a way to try to create an environment of censorship through bullying of this sort. But I really appreciated the amount of detail that you, the amount of attention you gave to the ways in which the UN commissioned these reports, specifically detailing sometimes falsehoods that were then discredited after the fact. And I want to hear
You're the closest one, huh?
Why
That sucks.
you thought that it was important to at least take out one of the ways in which I think Western media and a lot of international organs of justice supposedly played a role in aiding and abetting the propaganda of Israel to justify Israel's genocide.
Well, that's a large question, and you're going to have to keep me on point. There are several issues that you raised. First of all, the first 2 points you made are correct, in my opinion. Number one,
You win.
rapes could have happened.
Yeah.
People who I have high respect for. When the issue first came up, I was skeptical. I was skeptical on personal grounds. Okay? I had been to Gaza. Remember, and here we do this free. Okay? The scenes that they were describing, they were kind of like this kind of frat boy bravado. Gang rape, cutting off a woman's breast, playing touch football with a woman's breast.
Truly.
Yeah, I had been to Gaza. I knew the young men there. And the kinds of scenes that they were describing seemed to require a kind of sexual self-confidence that didn't seem to click with the young men in Gaza. So from the beginning, I was a bit skeptical. But then friends of mine, I won't name them, people you know, they say, look, Norm, in times of war, crazy things happen, rape happens, sexual violence happens. No reason to assume that it didn't happen here. So, like you,
That was my initial assessment as well.
like you, I agreed at that point at the beginning. I didn't accept it, but I saw it as a plausible possibility that I had to be open. Number two, you're absolutely correct. In the big picture, listen, we all agree killing people is worse than raping them. That should be pretty obvious. As a crime, murder.
Don't be scared. I just want to play.
Ranks higher than rape. Now, some people say don't rank them. No, we always rank them. That's why we have homicide, murder, first-degree murder, second-degree murder, third-degree murder. We're always making hierarchies of crimes. We have misdemeanors. If 1,200 people were killed, that's horrible enough. It's not going to change the big picture if rape and sexual violence happen. It's wrong, it's terrible, but the big picture was horrible enough. Which actually raised a very interesting question. The interesting question is, if it didn't happen, why did Israel make that their litmus test? That's where they laid down, they threw down the gauntlet. You had to agree that sexual violence, including rape, happened, or you became the equivalent of a Holocaust denier. And it was an interesting question. Why did you make that your red line? There were so many other red lines, killing children, and all sorts of other, pretty terrible things that happened. October 7th. Why did they make that the red line? And that brings us to the next question. Why did they make a red line of something that didn't happen? That, to me, is a point of reflection. If you look at the record, and I've gone through it as closely as possible, if you look at the record, what do we know? Let's start with the basics. There's no forensic evidence of rape. Now, Israel had a plausible explanation of that. The plausible explanation was they weren't prepared for a crime of this magnitude, 1,200 corpses. And so they processed the bodies very quickly to prepare for the ritual death, the ritual burying. Okay? They didn't preserve any bodily fluids and any other signs that a rape had occurred. I don't know if it's true or not, but I would say it's certainly plausible. So I was willing to set aside the absence of any forensic evidence of rape. So now, you have no forensic evidence of rape. That's going to leave for material evidence. We'll leave witnesses aside from them. Material evidence, there's no, what Camilla Patton, who was the UN Special Envoy, she says very late in her report, she says, no medical legal evidence of rape. And then that brings us to the second material evidence of rape, and that is digital evidence. Now, digital evidence is a very interesting case. So listen up. The most recent report that came out by an Israeli, Dr. Elkayam Levy, he says we have 10,000 photographs and digital segments from October 7th. 10,000. He also says it would take 1,800 hours to go through all of that digital and photographic evidence from October 7th. Now, if you do the simple calculation, which I did, and I was going over it in my mind last night to make sure for your show I don't get it wrong. You know, if you were a single researcher and you were working 8 hours a day, every day of the week, including weekends, you know how long it would take you to go through all of that digital evidence? How long? More than 7 months. And it was a very confined area. It was the Gaza envelope.
Yeah.
Okay? So, as a first approximation, you could say, not much with the same collective lens of 10,000 photographs, digital segments.
Including GoPro camera footage from the militants
We're
themselves.
going to go through CCTV,
Yeah.
traffic cameras, iPhones, on the militants themselves, body cams, dash cams, GoPros. So now, where was the digital evidence? There isn't one. I hope your viewers will hear. But listen, there is not one single frame of Hamas committing rape or sexual violence. Bear in mind, it's not only just an absence of any digital evidence, which would take 7 months to go through, of all the various technological paraphernalia, CCTV, graphic camera, body cam, dash cam, GoPro, not one of rape, not one of sexual violence. Not one frame. Now here is the thing that's most perplexing. So in that most recent report by Dr. Elkayam Levy, he says that Hamas instrumentalized all this digital evidence to terrorize Israeli society. They purposely posted horrific pictures on their social media. They sent pictures to family members. So, if Hamas had any pictures of sexual violence or rape, she'd have posted it, according to her. That's what she said. They were purposely posting horrific images to terrify and terrorize Israeli society. They didn't post it. So, what is the only, in my opinion, what's the only possible conclusion? If they didn't post any, it's because they didn't have any such images. And if they didn't have any such images, it's because it never happened.
Yes, including the body camera footage that Israel also extracted later down the line as well from some of the militants.
Yes,
that
they
were
captured and killed. They took the cameras. There was nothing there. Now, you might say, well, Hamas didn't want to damage its reputation by filming that stuff, but there's a problem
But
with
Israel
it.
would present this as evidence.
So you can make the argument maybe they turned off the camera. I don't believe it for a moment. But the problem with it is, you said that they were instrumentalizing these pictures in order to terrify and terrorize. So they wouldn't have turned off the camera. They would have purposely photographed it and then transmitted it. So by their own argument, it couldn't have happened. Now, as I said, there's...
So let's start with the why.
Why?
Why was rape, sexual assault?
So I'm at the coffee shop and this woman walks up to me like, hey, I saw one of your ads, but you actually have me mobile. I was like, yeah. Right. She was really like, okay, prove it. I put in my phone and I showed her in the top right corner, it says mint. And I was telling her how much I was saving compared to what I used to pay. She was almost shocked. Like, genuinely shocked that mint was actually good. And I was telling her that now is pretty much the easiest time for her to switch. Because Mint's offering where you can choose any other plans, the 3-month plan, 6-month plan, or the 12-month plan. Yes, this includes unlimited wireless. Any of them for $15 a month. I'm just out here doing my civic duty. Putting people onto a great deal, having them take advantage of it, save money. Simple. I don't know if she went home and switched, but that's what you should be doing.
This is a program where you get to see everything you've learned and worked for and make a difference.
It's one of the best PT schools just because of how hands-on we are.
It was rape, sexual assault. It like sexual assault directed by Hamas. Why was that the initial line of attack in your by your estimation from the Israeli side?
I think there were basically two reasons. First of all of Israeli propaganda is directed at American society. And in the United States, the rape, the dark-hued Arab raping a virginal white woman, has a deep historical resonance. So it was going to play well here. The second reason, and I probably will get criticized for this, because of the woke culture. And that's what I think happened with the UN investigations, what happened with the Human Rights Watch investigation, what happened with the Amnesty investigation. That they, because Me Too, believe women, you're not allowed to question, they don't like Muslims to begin with, these liberal organizations. They don't. I mean, we should be on. I mean, I can speak at length about the relationship. The human rights organizations had a very different relationship with the West Bank than they did with Gaza. Because in the West Bank, Ramallah is like another metropolis, has a higher standard of living than most big cities in the world. They can relate to that secular culture in Ramallah. They can't relate to Gaza. And so there's always been, by the liberal, secular human rights organizations, there's always been a double standard when it came to Gaza. So I think that there was a certain kind of certainty that you could play that hard and get away with it when it came to sexual violence and rape, which in other aspects the human rights organizations weren't bad in their investigations. It was this particular issue where they capitulated, and I think they capitulated because of the woke culture.
So you then...
I mean, there were points where it's just... it was really, I have to say, it was stomach churning. So they want to prove, let's say, take the case of the UN Commission of Inquiry, headed by Navi Pillay, who was the former High Commissioner for Human Rights, a respected figure in South African and Indian descent. So she knows there's no evidence of sexual violence. She knows that. She knows there's no forensic evidence, digital evidence. But she has to go along with the woke culture. So what does she do? She says, well, we saw pictures of women hostages who were taken and that they were placed on motor scooters or motorcycles between two Hamas militants. You're thinking, yeah, okay, there's one place, and we all know taking hostages is wrong, not a complicated question. But what does this have to do with sexual violence? She says, by placing two Hamas militants in the front and back of her, Hamas was guilty of expression, coerce into taking hostages. But is there a new rule of international law that if you take a woman hostage, you have to book an Uber? I mean, this is just stupid. But they were so desperate, clutching at straws to come up with an argument. As I said, I think it was in large part, first of all, it's the revulsion against Muslim men. And they were honest about that, by the way. They said in the human rights reports that Israel in particular was targeting Muslim young men and older men. That was their that was clearly a target. I think they even called it acts of extermination or crimes against humanity. But the truth of the matter is they all carry that prejudice. And the Israelis knew that that prejudice would resonate in the United States in particular.